With the moving truck behind her, my mother-in-law said triumphantly.
I won't be giving out my address to a stranger like you.
Behind her, my husband was getting into the car, smirking. He was seriously planning to go along with his parents. I bit my lip quietly. They are always like this. They assume I will never talk back, so they do whatever they want. My father-in-law is a decent man, but his thinking is outdated. He believes women should obey and be taken care of by their husbands, so he isn't much help. But honestly, I'd reached my limit. I had endured and endured, filling a cup with all the frustration, and today was the last drop. Well, I guess I'm divorcing my freeloading husband then. When I said that, my in-laws laughed in unison.
Dream on, you idiot daughter-in-law.
They still don't know. They don't know my husband depends on me financially, or that even the small income he earned is thanks to me. And I'm sure they don't realize that I have a breaking point. My name is Sarah Johnson, and I'm 50 years old. I work at a small local supermarket that my brother runs. It was originally our parents' business, but when my father's health declined after he turned 60, my brother took over. It started as a family-owned shop, but it's grown into a beloved local establishment. Though it's a store, it operates like a company, so I hold an official position there as well. When my parents were still working, my father was the president, and my mother was the vice president. But my brother's wife is a teacher, so she couldn't work for us. From my brother's generation, I became the vice president. Currently, the only family I live with is my husband, Kevin. We have a daughter who's already married, and she visits us a few times a year. But she and her husband live far away in another state, so we don't see them often. Kevin and I were high school classmates. Back then, we were just classmates. At the time, I was quite shy and didn't have many male friends, let alone a boyfriend. I remember Kevin, being popular, was always surrounded by his usual group of friends, while I mostly spent time with my female friends. Kevin and I reconnected as adults, hit it off, and eventually got married.
I love how calm and kind you are, Sarah.
He said shyly as he pledged his future to me. It wasn't until it was too late that I realized marrying him was the wrong choice. Right after we got married, the insults from my mother-in-law began.
You should quit your job and devote yourself to Kevin, and you better have kids soon, or you're worthless as a wife.
That was one of the first things she said. At the time, I was just a supermarket employee. My husband was still working normally back then, so I could somewhat understand why my mother-in-law, being from an older generation, didn't appreciate my job. But telling me I was useless without kids was too much. Even after I had a child, she didn't change. I gave birth to a girl, and my mother-in-law smugly said,
A girl? What a disappointment. You need to have a boy soon. Both my children were boys.
To me, my daughter was my precious, irreplaceable child. But to her, she was just a girl. My husband loved our daughter, but whenever we visited his parents, he never stood up to his mother. In fact, he would join in mocking me.
She can't seem to have another kid, and her cooking is terrible. Nothing like Mom's.
At that, my mother-in-law would clap her hands in delight and laugh. In her good mood, she'd hand my husband some pocket money, which he'd use to buy booze and sleazy magazines, thrilled as could be. He could at least take my side once in a while. And isn't it unfair to our daughter? When I voiced my complaints after we got home, my husband sighed, clearly annoyed.
She's just a baby, so there's no way she understands, and you're overreacting. Just play along with Mom, and she'll stay happy. You need to tough it out.
It hurt more than I could express, but he was right. I only see her when we visit their house. Maybe I should just swallow my pride and accept that things would go smoothly as long as I endured it. The bitterness never fully faded, but I kept holding on. However, things took a turn for the worse. My mother-in-law, who I only had to see when we visited her, started coming over to our house. This all started when my husband lost his jobs. His company went under due to financial troubles, leaving him unemployed. As an unemployed man, my husband had no income aside from unemployment benefits. That income was temporary and wouldn't last long. Obviously, we couldn't sustain our living situation like that. So I accepted a full-time job with a managerial position my brother had offered me, and I began working full-time. Our household now relied entirely on my income. With the justification of helping her son, my mother-in-law began intruding into our lives. My father-in-law seemed exasperated by her overprotectiveness, but she didn't care one bit. Her behavior was over the top. She seemed to dislike everything I did. I was floored when she actually took the laundry I had folded out of the drawers and refolded it. I couldn't comprehend what drove her to such extremes. If she hated it so much, why bother coming to our house when I'm here?
Sarah, when are you going to quit your job? The reason Kevin can't find work is because you're still working.
My mother-in-law began spouting nonsense at me, the only one supporting the household. When I looked to my husband for support, he awkwardly averted his eyes. It wasn't my fault that he couldn't find a job. He had no technical skills and only experience in office work, with no special abilities. Even so, he could have found a job if he hadn't been so picky, but he kept saying, "I won't do anything but office work. I can't handle physical jobs, and I won't work late hours." In short, the reason he couldn't find a job was his own doing. Yet in my mother-in-law's mind, my working was the root cause of all problems, draining his motivation. And she still hadn't changed her attitude toward our daughter.
Grandma's here.
Despite saying things like that, my mother-in-law still openly declared that my daughter was less valuable than a boy. When my daughter, old enough to understand, started avoiding her grandmother's constant insults, my mother-in-law sneered, "You're just like your mother. There's nothing cute about you." Our daughter was devastated, and all my husband did was lounge in front of the TV, not lifting a finger to help. How could you say that? If you don't like me or our daughter, why even bother coming here? Unable to hold back my frustration, I spoke, and my mother-in-law arrogantly replied,
This is my son's house. If you've got a problem, then you're the one who should leave.
"Let me remind you, my husband was still unemployed. It was my income keeping the household afloat." I was furious with my mother-in-law for refusing to see reality. And every time I saw my husband lying there, pretending not to hear, it broke my heart. When I finally reported the situation to my father-in-law, who adored his granddaughter, he scolded my mother-in-law. She stopped making comments about our daughter and reduced her visits by half. A few years later, my husband decided to completely give up on working and became a full-blown recluse. Meanwhile, I threw myself into work, coming up with new ideas from a homemaker's perspective to help boost the supermarket sales. When the store posted a job opening for part-time help, I approached my husband. "It's an easy job. Why don't you give it a try?" In the end, I managed to get him to work 2 days a week. When we visited my in-laws during the summer holidays, my husband proudly announced that he had found a job. I thought to myself that he hadn't done it on his own at all, but I decided to support him warmly since at least he had started working.
You finally found a job. Kevin, you're really amazing. Now work hard and keep your wife quiet. Make sure she quits her job soon. A wife's job is to take care of the home, after all.
My mother-in-law said this loudly enough for me to hear, directing it at my husband. And every time we ran into friends or neighbors at the cemetery during the visit, she'd start bad-mouthing me.
She's such a cheap wife, working at her parents' company just to make some pocket money. It's so embarrassing. She neglects the house, and my poor son suffers because of it.
I had to endure my mother-in-law ridiculing me in front of everyone.
Enough. Stop embarrassing yourself.
The only one who finally spoke up was my father-in-law, who couldn't stand it any longer. Meanwhile, my husband remained silent, and the sadness within me only grew. Still, I kept enduring. As long as my mother-in-law didn't come around, my husband, while lazy, was a kind father. I believed that as long as our daughter was still living with us, it was better for her to have a father around, so I continued to put up with everything. Even when I no longer had to endure, I couldn't summon the strength to go through with a divorce. The fact that my mother-in-law rarely visited anymore made a big difference. The turning point came this year. My in-laws were moving from the house they had lived in for years to a condo. They planned to stay there for the rest of their lives. The view from the balcony was fantastic. My father-in-law seemed more energetic than usual, excited about downsizing and living within their means. I understood and supported their desire to move to a more manageable home. But moving was tough. Their house was packed with stuff, and most of it wouldn't fit into the smaller condo unless a significant amount was thrown out. Clothes that were out of style or no longer fit, countless paper bags, and even unopened gifts from who knows when were discovered. While we could sell towels and other items they'd been given, food past its expiration date had to be thrown away. And there were way too many dishes for 2 people, so they had to be reduced too. Mary, there's no way all of this will fit. I know you don't want to throw things away, but the new place is smaller, right? Most of the things that needed to be discarded belonged to my mother-in-law. Naturally, she didn't want me touching them and reacted badly whenever I tried to help.
Don't you dare touch my things. What? Are you hoping to take them, greedy?
Clutching what was essentially junk, she glared at me. I figured it was pointless to say anything more, shrugged my shoulders, and left. Finally, the day of the move arrived. I still hadn't been told the exact location of their new condo. Honestly, I wasn't all that interested, so I decided to wait until they mentioned it. The moving truck was the smallest size, barely bigger than a pickup truck. As I watched, I worried about whether everything would fit. As expected, some things didn't. My husband started loading the excess into our car. Before I knew it, my in-laws had gotten into the car, and there was no room left for me. As I stood there confused, my husband calmly started the engine. Panicking, I knocked on the window. "What's going on? Are you taking your parents? Should I wait here?" Without even looking at me, my husband rolled down the window and said,
Yeah, you can go home on your own. I'm moving in with them. Take some time off work for me, will you? Later.
As I stood there in shock, the back door of the car opened. It was my mother-in-law who got out of the car. My mother-in-law declared with a triumphant look on her face,
Kevin told us how miserable he is being scolded by you every day, so we're taking him with us. You can stay here alone, cool off, and think about what you've done.
After she finished speaking, my mother-in-law deliberately gave my shoulder a shove. Reluctantly, I asked, though I didn't want to, "Could you give me your new address, just in case?"
I don't give my address to strangers.
I had finally reached my breaking point, my shoulders slumped in defeat. I could feel the dam in my heart burst, releasing all the pent-up frustration. Today was the day I decided this would be the final drop. That's what I thought. All right then, I'm divorcing my freeloading husband. I said it calmly, but I put just a little emphasis on freeloading. My mother-in-law heard me loud and clear. She glanced at my husband, but quickly regained her composure and glared at me with contempt. My father-in-law, who had been in the car, didn't seem to catch what I said and stepped out, looking confused. To make sure he understood, I repeated myself clearly. I'm divorcing Kevin, who's been freeloading off me. Please leave. I'm done taking care of him. Thank you for everything, I said politely, and over the sound of the engine, my in-laws laughed.
Dream on, you idiot daughter-in-law.
They still didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. Leaning out the window with a smirk, my father-in-law looked up at me.
Kevin's working now, so there's no way he's freeloading. If you divorce him, you won't be able to make it on your own.
I couldn't help but pity my father-in-law's frown. Thinking to myself that it's his son who can't manage on his own, I tilted my head slightly. You're aware of my income, right? My father-in-law shook his head. As I stood there in shock, my mother-in-law snapped.
You live off your parents' money, so don't act so high and mighty.
It was at this moment that I finally realized. My in-laws truly had no understanding of our financial situation. At the very least, I had told my mother-in-law when I first took on this job. Maybe it was so long ago that she had forgotten, or maybe she never cared enough to listen in the first place. In any case, I never imagined they hadn't understood this much. But at this point, it doesn't really matter anymore. Got it. I'll send the divorce papers soon, I said, feeling strangely calm. I didn't even care to explain further. Once I'd made up my mind, I found myself feeling no emotional attachment to the situation. Then my husband chimed in mockingly.
You don't even know the address. How are you gonna send them? You're not as smart as you think, huh?
He chuckled, guiding his parents into the car. After a short honk of the horn, they drove off. I silently watched them go. When I got home by taxi, I went straight to City Hall to pick up divorce papers and began filling them out. Not knowing their current address wasn't an issue. I could just mail it addressed to Mr. Kevin Johnson, care of Mr. Tom Johnson, using their old address. As long as they filed a change of address, the mail should reach their new place. My mother-in-law subscribed to a few supplements by mail, so I was confident they'd get it. I made sure to send the papers via certified mail, just to be safe. On the way back, I prepared several backup copies of the divorce papers in case the first set got torn up. A few days later, as I was filling out one of the spare copies, the house phone rang. I thought it was my husband, but it wasn't. The voice on the phone was my father-in-law.
Hello? I got the divorce papers. Is this for real? Isn't this going too far just to make a point?
I couldn't help but chuckle at the fact that he still thought it was just for show. I used to think my father-in-law was the reasonable one, but maybe he wasn't so different from my mother-in-law and husband after all. Yes, I'm completely serious. You can either file them yourselves, or I've included a return envelope if you prefer to send them back to me. And don't worry about our living situation. I'm an executive at a company, so I do have my own income, I replied firmly. My father-in-law seemed taken aback and muttered,
A woman as an executive? That can't be true.
He still didn't believe me. I could have sworn I'd mentioned before that our family business was small, and I was the vice president, but I wondered how he had interpreted that. There's a chance he hadn't really listened to me in the first place. In fact, my father-in-law's hearing is quite poor, so he may have simply misheard. There are female executives in other companies too, you know. But you don't have to believe me. I've reached my limit. Enough is enough. I didn't feel like explaining further, so I remained calm and matter of fact. Honestly, I was getting tired. My father-in-law let out a low groan.
I see. All right, I won't say anything more. I'm sorry for all the hardship we've caused you.
From the pained tone of his voice, I could sense that he genuinely felt sorry, which made me feel a bit relieved. It seemed that my father-in-law was the only one who had some decency after all. Feeling a bit more at ease, I politely said, "No worries, thank you," and hung up. Half a day after that call, my next contact was from my husband. My phone rang while I was out, and I saw his name on the screen. It was the perfect opportunity, so I turned on the recording function before answering.
Hey, this is insane. Why did you send me those papers? You're seriously divorcing me out of nowhere? I'll sue you.
"Excuse me?"
I won't let this slide.
The nerve of him to say such things after he had moved out on his own accord was beyond ridiculous. He had declared me a stranger and left without even giving me an address, so of course I considered divorce. Him playing the victim was infuriating. Emotional abuse over the years is probably the main reason, I'd say. It's quite sad, really, that the journals I've kept since we were young will serve as evidence. Also, since you walked out without any warning, it looks like you'll be at fault in this case. That's what my lawyer said anyway. As I explained, my husband kept interrupting with "huh" and "what" in an increasingly rude tone. It was hard to tell if he was even listening, but the moment I mentioned lawyer, he panicked.
A lawyer? Wait, you're not serious, are you?
His voice, filled with alarm, echoed through the room. I had my phone on speaker mode while I was talking. I did it so the person in front of me could hear the conversation as well. Smiling at the person in front of me, I confidently answered, "Of course I'm serious. I'm in the middle of consulting with my lawyer right now." I was about to tell him to stop contacting me directly and go through my lawyer when he cut me off, shouting,
No, I'm not getting divorced. What about my job? I'll be humiliated. Let's meet and talk this through. I'm coming home right now. Please, let's talk.
I heard my mother-in-law in the background, faintly urging him to just let the divorce happen, which made me smile wryly. The person in front of me, my lawyer, gave me a knowing look as if to say, "Here we go again." As I pondered what to do, the lawyer quickly scribbled a note and passed it to me. It said, "Have him come to the office." Following the suggestion, I told my husband, "I'm not at home. I'm at my lawyer's office. So if you insist on meeting, come here." After giving him the office address, he hung up, promising to come. I sipped the coffee my lawyer's assistant had brought me as I waited for him to show up. I wondered, would he really come? Knowing him, he might get scared and back out at the last minute. As we were talking, my husband arrived not long after. This would be our first face-to-face meeting with the lawyer present, but to my surprise, my husband didn't come alone. His parents were with him. I immediately guessed that he had probably begged them to come along because he couldn't handle this on his own. I was exasperated. How much longer would he remain so dependent? When my husband entered the office, he looked nervous. He seemed unable to settle down, glancing around restlessly at everything. I sat next to my lawyer, waiting for my husband and his parents to take their seats across from us. It was time for a direct confrontation.
Well, I can't believe this is really happening. Divorce? I mean, come on.
The moment we were seated, my husband began mumbling quickly in a low voice. It was quite a contrast from how he had shouted over the phone earlier, but now, in front of others, he could barely speak above a whisper. I was firm. No, I absolutely want a divorce. I never want to live with you again. And since we're here with a legal professional, let's discuss the division of property. My husband flinched, his body trembling slightly. He then glanced at the lawyer and quickly shut his mouth. It was pathetic. He always acted tough with me and the female part-time workers, but in front of a male lawyer, he was reduced to this. I couldn't help but sigh. He stayed silent after that, while my father-in-law sat with his arms crossed and his eyes closed. I glanced over at my mother-in-law, who glared at me openly, her emotions on full display.
Property? Ha! You're not getting a single penny.
With that, she suddenly tried to throw her hot coffee at me. Luckily, one of the office staff quickly intervened and stopped her. It was a close call. Legally, the assets accumulated during the marriage should be divided equally between Kevin and me. After all, income earned during the marriage is considered joint property under the law. But if both parties agree we could do things differently, that's fine with me. Let's forget about dividing the property. I replied coolly. The truth was, I had earned most of the money. The bank accounts with our savings were all in my name. Even the car my husband liked to drive around as if it were his was actually registered in my name. His bank account, which he left at home, only had $20 left in it, since payday was still a few days away. In other words, he didn't have much in terms of assets. Giving up the division of property meant I'd essentially keep everything. This was a terrible situation for him, yet he still sat there in silence, fidgeting awkwardly. Is that all right with you? I asked, as if I were talking to a child. Finally, my father-in-law opened his eyes, leaned over, and whispered to my husband.
Tell her the truth.
But still, my husband didn't respond. Instead, he muttered, well, and then, unbelievably, buried his face in his mother's lap. As she gently stroked his head, she continued glaring at me. It was at that moment I truly understood the feeling of being disgusted. It was revolting. In the end, we agreed to proceed with the divorce without dividing the property. When I pulled out the spare divorce papers I brought with me, my husband's face became even more pitiful. My father-in-law gave me a meaningful nod as we made eye contact. He hadn't been on my side, but at least he wasn't my enemy either. I realized that while he held on to the belief that men are superior to women, he was at least a person who could admit when he was wrong. Once my in-laws and my husband left, I finally allowed myself to smile. The lawyer sitting next to me had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, but I realized later that he had been biting the inside of his cheek, trying to suppress laughter. After all, we were supposed to be negotiating the division of property, yet my soon-to-be ex-husband had given up everything without a fight. After the discussion, I rushed to submit the divorce papers I had just obtained. I was finally free. But it wasn't over yet. The following week, my ex-husband Kevin showed up at my workplace. It would have been fine if he had come to work, but that wasn't the case. He completely ignored his job and followed me around.
Sarah, I'm sorry. You haven't filed the divorce papers yet, have you? I'll come back home, so let's just drop this whole thing.
I had my own job to do, and Kevin's job was in a different section. Having him trail behind me was an absolute nuisance. I told him repeatedly to go back to his post, but he refused to listen. Instead, he rushed out in front of me in the store and threw himself on the floor, lying spread eagle.
Please, I'm begging you.
As he screamed and flailed his legs, drawing the attention of the customers, I felt a wave of dizziness come over me. I knew I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to fire him. My brother and all the employees supported the decision. In fact, several complaints had already been filed against Kevin's poor work behavior. Truthfully, I had kept him employed out of my own misplaced sense of responsibility. No one was sorry to see him go. The next day, my mother-in-law stormed into the supermarket again, furious, shouting, "You got my son fired. You must have told the company something." We led her to the break room in the back to avoid making a scene. At my brother's suggestion, I called Kevin and asked him and my father-in-law to join us. With my brother and several employees watching, the final conversation began. I started by explaining Kevin's embarrassing behavior from the previous day. Then I addressed my mother-in-law's accusation that I had told the company something. I didn't need to tell anyone anything. I made the decision to fire him. His behavior was disrupting the business. There's no way we could keep him employed. My father-in-law, seemingly impressed, responded.
You have that kind of authority?
Everyone from the supermarket nodded in agreement. Of course, my ex-husband understood as well. He hunched his shoulders and shrank back. Only my mother-in-law looked utterly shocked. I calmly laid out the facts. Of course I do. I'm the assistant manager and vice president. It's a small company, so most decisions are made directly between the president and me. It finally dawned on my mother-in-law what my position actually was, and her face turned pale. She grabbed Kevin's arm, trying to pull him up and make him face me. Ignoring them, my father-in-law continued with his questioning.
So, you were the one earning more?
I nodded slowly. Yes, Kevin was a part-timer working 2 days a week. I receive an executive salary. He earns less than 1/10 of what I do. And while he accused me of getting my job through family connections, Kevin himself was hired entirely because of me. That was a mistake. This outcome is the right one. This time, my mother-in-law was speechless. By now, it should have been clear who had been supporting the household. The fact that she hadn't known was shocking. But at this point, it no longer mattered. This is just revenge. You're mixing personal and professional, Kevin shouted. I sighed. It was time for him to find a new job elsewhere. The idea that he still wanted to work at our company after all this was absurd. Your work behavior was awful. We'd had multiple complaints from other employees about you napping in the break room during work hours or making inappropriate comments to female employees. I scolded you every time, remember? Or did you run off to your parents because you couldn't handle me telling you off? My voice unintentionally lowered as I spoke. Kevin, my ex-husband, gulped and then burst into tears.
Kevin would never do such things.
I pulled out the evidence. We had footage from security cameras and recordings other employees had taken. There were plenty of records of his misconduct. Honestly, I felt like I should be penalized for ever hiring someone like him. My mother-in-law was in shock. At first, I thought she was going to pat him on the head again, but instead she grabbed his ear and twisted it with surprising force.
What on earth have you been doing?
Kevin yelped and tried to shield his head from the blows. But his mother wasn't done yet. She grabbed a cushion and started hitting him with it. With no other choice, I turned to speak to my father-in-law, the only one still sitting quietly and watching. For all the time he wasn't working, I was secretly filling in, doing extra shift with the part-timers. I even sent apology gifts to those affected. It was my fault for letting this go on. I'm relieved he's finally been fired. My mother-in-law sobbed bitterly. My father-in-law, on the other hand, looked pained as he offered an apology to all of us employees.
Let's go home. Sarah, I'll have a talk with Kevin. I promise we'll stay out of your life from now on. Thank you for everything.
With that, he stood up. Being a man of old-fashioned values, I trusted him to keep his word. For the first time, I felt I could believe in his sincerity. Kevin, on the other hand, looked like his world had just ended. His mother, gritting her teeth, suddenly snapped in a hoarse voice.
How can you say that? It's such a huge loss. We need to get Sarah back for Kevin's sake.
It was clear now that she finally understood who Kevin really was. Up until this moment, she hadn't realized how much he relied on me. Without me, Kevin's life would fall apart. And that was exactly what I wanted, so I had no intention of helping. Just as I was about to respond, a booming voice filled the room, shaking the walls.
Enough already.
It was my father-in-law, shouting at the top of his lungs. He stood tall, his eyebrows furrowed in anger, looking like a statue of fierce determination. Even my mother-in-law, for once, couldn't respond, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly as she looked down. My ex-husband, fully absorbing his father's anger, cowered with a terrified expression.
She may be your wife, but she's someone else's daughter. And at the end of the day, she's a stranger. Stop trying to leech off her. Don't you have any shame? Plus, it's clear today just how much trouble Kevin's caused. Kevin, apologize deeply.
His anger was so intense that even I was taken aback. I hadn't expected such a fierce outburst from my father-in-law, who had usually been so quiet. I realized that maybe I didn't know him or my in-laws as well as I thought. In the end, Kevin didn't apologize, protected by his mother, and they quickly left. Before leaving, though, my father-in-law turned to face me one last time and apologized. "Thank you, Tom. Please take care of yourself and stay well," I said, returning his gesture as I saw him off. "I think I'll forgive him alone." All right, let's get back to work. With that, life at the supermarket returned to normal. Now, let me tell you what happened later. After that, my in-laws were left living off their pension while supporting their unemployed son in his 50s. I happened to see my mother-in-law in town one day, and she looked frail and much smaller than I remembered. Rumor has it that Kevin is now essentially a recluse, completely useless. Since then, I haven't seen Kevin once. But what comes next is something I heard from my daughter. About 3 years after the divorce, there was a funeral for my father-in-law. Since she was his grandchild, my daughter attended the funeral. Apparently, his death was sudden, without any time to prepare. They hadn't even saved enough money for the funeral, so it was a very simple ceremony. Now, my mother-in-law and ex-husband were left to live alone, but life was far from smooth for them. Without my father-in-law, who had always been neat and orderly, their home quickly turned into a hoarder's house. They'd become the outcasts of the neighborhood. On top of that, with my father-in-law's pension gone, both of them began begging their relatives for money, which only made them more disliked. They're struggling financially, but that has nothing to do with me. They'll sink deeper into isolation and poverty from here on out. I thought of my ex-husband and his mother. I didn't feel any urge to help them. If anything, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Years have passed since then, and I'm now living happily on my own in a lovely condo. I never realized how wonderful it would be to have so much time just for myself. One of my greatest joys now is inviting my friends of my age and hosting dinner parties. My daughter and her husband are fond of me as well. In fact, my daughter told me she plans to cut all ties with her father and grandmother, as she never liked either of them. That's probably for the best. Especially now, you need to prioritize your health. If they're causing you stress, stay away from them. There's no need to let them meet the baby either. As I said this, my daughter gently touched her growing belly. I'm about to become a grandmother. Of course, I'm happy to help my daughter and her husband in any way I can, but I also plan to be careful not to interfere too much in their lives. As I approach my 60s, I noticed that some of my friends are either single by choice or widowed. Recently, we've been discussing the possibility of sharing a house full of single aunties. Instead of swallowing my feelings, I'm now looking forward to a life where I can talk openly with close friends and live together in harmony. Surrounded by so much happiness, I'm confident that my best days are still ahead of me.